A strange pattern. Mrs. Layla sat down at the dinner table, surrounded by her family. Her son, Imran, and his wife, Sarah, had invited her over for their usual Sunday meal. It was always a comforting tradition. Sarah took pride in her cooking, always putting together beautiful dishes, and Mrs. Layla loved spending time with her family in such a warm setting. But lately, something had started to bother Mrs. Layla. Over the past few weeks, she had noticed a strange pattern. Every time she ate a meal at Imran and Sarah's house, she would feel unwell. It was never immediate, but within an hour or so after finishing her plate, she would begin to feel a heavy discomfort in her stomach. Sometimes her head would ache, her energy would drain, and she'd even feel slightly dizzy. At first, she thought it was just a coincidence, maybe a sign of her age or a small flu bug, but the pattern was undeniable. She only felt sick after eating Sarah's food. The feeling had become so noticeable that Mrs. Layla started to dread these Sunday dinners, even though she loved her family's company. But how could she say something without hurting Sarah's feelings? After all, Sarah was a kind daughter-in-law and always put effort into making everything just right. Mrs. Layla didn't want to come across as ungrateful or picky. Besides, it was just her. Imran ate the same food and never seemed to have any problem at all. As they ate dinner together that Sunday, Mrs. Layla felt the familiar worry creeping into her thoughts. She glanced at the dish Sarah had served, a steaming plate of her signature chicken biryani. The spices smelled rich and inviting, and everyone at the table was digging in happily, chatting and laughing. For a moment, Mrs. Layla tried to ignore her worries and enjoy the meal. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe she'd feel fine after all. But as she took her first bite, she felt a sense of unease. She couldn't help but notice a strange taste, something she hadn't quite tasted in Sarah's cooking before. She wasn't sure if it was just her imagination or if Sarah had used a different spice this time. But she kept eating, not wanting to raise any suspicions. She hoped that if she pushed the worry aside, it would all go away. As dinner went on, Mrs. Layla tried to focus on the conversation around her. Imran was sharing a funny story from his work, making everyone laugh. Sarah was nodding along, her face lighting up with a smile. The two of them looked so happy together, and it warmed Mrs. Layla's heart to see her son in such a loving marriage. She didn't want to spoil the moment or cast any shadows over the meal, so she continued eating, trying to keep her worries hidden. Yet, as the meal ended and they moved to the living room for tea, Mrs. Layla felt the familiar signs returning. Her stomach began to churn uncomfortably, and a dull headache started to form. She tried her best to ignore it, sipping her tea and engaging in the conversation. But as the discomfort grew stronger, it became impossible to hide. Mrs. Layla's hand rested on her stomach, and she forced a small smile as she listened to Sarah talk about a new recipe she wanted to try. Seeing Mrs. Layla's discomfort, Sarah's face turned concerned. "Are you feeling okay, Amy?" Sarah asked, leaning forward with a worried look. Mrs. Layla smiled weakly, not wanting to alarm her. "Oh, it's nothing, Beta. Just a little tired, I think. Maybe it's the weather. I'll be fine." But deep down, Mrs. Layla knew it wasn't just the weather. She had been feeling fine all day before coming over. It was always like this. She would feel perfectly healthy until she ate Sarah's food. Then, without fail, the same uneasy feeling would settle over her. As she left Imran and Sarah's house that night, her mind raced with thoughts. She didn't want to jump to conclusions or accuse anyone unfairly, especially not her daughter-in-law. But the pattern was too clear to ignore any longer. Every time she ate there, she got sick. Could it really just be her imagination? Or was there something in Sarah's cooking that didn't sit well with her? Over the next few days, Mrs. Layla couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She didn't want to believe anything negative about her daughter-in-law, but she also knew she couldn't continue feeling sick after every visit. She decided she would pay closer attention the next time she visited to see if she could figure out exactly what was causing her illness. Maybe it was a specific ingredient or a particular spice that Sarah used. Mrs. Layla knew she had to get to the bottom of this, but she wanted to do it quietly and without making Sarah feel bad. As the days passed, Mrs. Layla grew more and more determined. She resolved to be vigilant at the next family dinner, to observe carefully and, if necessary, to take a small portion of food home with her to analyze. She knew it sounded extreme, but she had to get answers. This strange sickness had gone on long enough, and she needed to know the truth. Sunday arrived again, and Mrs. Layla prepared herself mentally. She smiled warmly as she entered Imran and Sarah's home, trying to push away her suspicions, but in her heart, she was ready. Today, she would pay attention to every detail. She would finally find out if there was a reason behind her illness or if, perhaps, it was all just an unfortunate coincidence. And so, as dinner began, and Sarah brought out the carefully prepared dishes, Mrs. Layla took a deep breath and braced herself. This time, she was determined to uncover the truth, no matter where it led her. Growing concerns. The following week, Mrs. Layla tried to put her worries aside. She thought that maybe she was just overthinking things, and perhaps her sickness had nothing to do with the food Sarah cooked. But the nagging feeling remained. She couldn't ignore how her body reacted every time she ate with Imran and Sarah. She had felt perfectly fine before each meal, only to be struck with stomach pain, dizziness, or nausea afterward. The pattern was becoming too consistent to ignore, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something in the food was behind it. As Sunday approached again, Mrs. Layla found herself growing anxious. She didn't want to cancel the dinner, as that would seem strange, but she was also nervous about feeling sick yet again. What could she do? Should she speak up, or would that only cause unnecessary tension? When she arrived at Imran and Sarah's house, she was greeted with warm smiles and hugs. Her son seemed happy to see her, and Sarah, as usual, had a lovely meal planned. As they sat down at the table, Mrs. Layla felt a mixture of dread and curiosity. She was trying hard to look for any small detail that could explain why she kept getting sick. The meal was laid out beautifully, with Sarah explaining each dish proudly. She had prepared a few of Mrs. Layla's favorites, like spicy curry, fresh naan, and a fragrant rice dish. Mrs. Layla's heart sank as she realized she would have to eat it to avoid raising any suspicions. She didn't want to hurt Sarah's feelings, so she put on a smile and complimented her on the presentation. As they ate, Mrs. Layla took small bites, hoping that if she ate less, she might avoid the sickness that usually followed. She was hyper-aware of every taste, every spice, trying to detect any unusual flavor that could hint at an ingredient she wasn't used to. But everything tasted just as delicious as ever. It was hard to believe that something so flavorful and lovingly made could be making her feel so ill. Soon, the family moved to the living room for tea, laughing and sharing stories as they always did. But, as expected, Mrs. Layla started feeling the familiar symptoms creeping in. Her stomach began to twist, and a faint headache pulsed behind her temples. She tried to ignore it, smiling along as Imran shared funny memories from his childhood, but the discomfort was getting harder to hide. Noticing her silence, Imran looked over, concerned. "Ammi, are you feeling okay? You look a little pale," he said, his brow furrowed. Mrs. Layla forced a reassuring smile. "Oh, I'm fine, Beta. Just a little tired," she replied, hoping he wouldn't press further. She didn't want to alarm them, especially since she still wasn't certain of the cause. But deep down, Mrs. Layla felt that something was wrong. The symptoms were too consistent, too reliable. It had to be connected to the food. She remembered how, the last time she skipped Sarah's meal, she had felt perfectly fine. The evidence was becoming clearer, but she still struggled with doubt. What if it really was just her imagination, or an odd reaction to the spices? She didn't want to unfairly blame Sarah, who had only ever been kind and welcoming to her. That night, when Mrs. Layla returned home, she thought deeply about what she should do. She knew she needed answers, but was unsure how to get them without causing any awkwardness between her and her daughter-in-law. Her friendship with Sarah mattered greatly to her, and she didn't want to risk damaging it. Eventually, Mrs. Layla decided that she needed to observe things more carefully. She would keep attending these dinners, but would pay closer attention to what she ate and how it made her feel. Maybe if she could narrow down the ingredients, she could figure out if it was a certain spice or food item that was causing the issue. It was a simple plan, but at least it allowed her to keep her suspicions quiet for now. As she lay in bed that night, her mind continued to race. What if she never found out the cause? Or what if, in the end, her fears were true and there was something harmful in the food? The thought sent a shiver down her spine, but she resolved to remain calm and patient. For now, she would play the role of a loving mother-in-law and wait for the right moment to uncover the truth. With her decision made, Mrs. Layla drifted off to sleep, hoping that she would finally be able to get to the bottom of this mystery, one careful observation at a time. A plan takes shape. Over the next few days, Mrs. Layla couldn't stop thinking about the strange sickness that struck her after every meal at Sarah's house. It was no longer just a worry in the back of her mind. It had become a puzzle she was determined to solve. But how could she figure out the truth without hurting her family? If she asked Sarah directly, she risked damaging their relationship. Yet, if she stayed silent, she would continue feeling sick every week. As Sunday approached once more, Mrs. Layla decided she needed a plan. This time, she would bring her own food as a backup. It was a delicate way to test if the problem was really with Sarah's cooking. She told herself she would take a few bites of Sarah's meal as usual, and if the symptoms appeared again, she would quietly switch to her own food. If she felt fine afterward, it would confirm her suspicions. To make this plan work, she needed a believable excuse. She decided to say she'd been following a new diet her doctor recommended, one meant to help her stomach settle. That way, she could bring her own food without hurting Sarah's feelings. Sunday evening arrived, and Mrs. Layla walked into Imran and Sarah's house with a gentle smile. In her bag, she had carefully packed a small container of rice and mild vegetable curry. She could feel her heart pounding with a mix of anxiety and determination. Today, she was one step closer to finding out if her suspicions were correct. As she sat down at the dinner table, she took a deep breath and shared her plan with Sarah and Imran. "I hope you don't mind, but I brought a small portion of my own food tonight," she said with a warm smile. "My doctor suggested a special diet to help with my stomach. I'll still try a little bit of what you made, Sarah. Everything looks delicious as always." Sarah's eyes widened with surprise, but she quickly smiled back. "Of course, Amy. I understand completely. I just want you to feel comfortable and enjoy the meal," she said kindly, though Mrs. Layla noticed a slight flicker of something in Sarah's expression. Was it surprise, or something else? Dinner proceeded as usual, with laughter and conversation filling the room. Mrs. Layla took small bites of Sarah's food, tasting the spices and savoring the familiar flavors. She hoped that maybe tonight would be different, that she would feel fine and her suspicions would turn out to be just a misunderstanding. But within minutes, the familiar heaviness returned to her stomach, followed by a wave of nausea. Her heart sank. Discreetly, she reached for her own food and began eating it slowly. The plain rice and vegetables seemed to settle her stomach, and soon the nausea started to ease. She couldn't ignore the proof any longer. Something in Sarah's cooking was making her sick. But what could it be? As the meal ended and they moved to the living room, Mrs. Layla's mind raced with questions. She had to find out what was causing her illness without confronting Sarah directly. Perhaps it was a certain spice or ingredient that her body simply couldn't handle, but how could she figure out which one? That night, as she lay in bed, Mrs. Layla's determination only grew. She decided she would start keeping a journal, writing down exactly what she ate at each dinner, how much of it she consumed, and how she felt afterward. If there was a specific ingredient that was causing her illness, she would eventually notice a pattern. This way, she could get to the truth while still preserving her relationship with Sarah. Mrs. Layla went to sleep with her mind set on the plan. Patterns began to emerge. The next few weeks brought a careful routine for Mrs. Layla. Each Sunday, she arrived at Sarah and Imran's house with a quiet resolve. She continued to bring her own food as backup, subtly eating it whenever the symptoms started. She also kept detailed notes in her journal, recording every dish Sarah served, each spice she could identify, and how her body reacted. At first, her notes seemed like a mess of information with no clear answers. But after 3 dinners, Mrs. Layla started noticing certain patterns. Each time she felt ill, there had been a specific dish or spice in the meal. A certain curry, or sometimes an herb Sarah frequently used in her cooking. She began to wonder if there was a single ingredient causing her reaction, but she still didn't have enough evidence to know for sure. During one of these dinners, Imran noticed his mother's journal and raised an eyebrow. "Ami, are you taking notes on Sarah's cooking?" he teased, trying to learn her secret recipes. Mrs. Layla chuckled, brushing it off. "Just writing down a few things to help me understand what works with my new diet," she replied with a gentle smile. But inside, she was tense. She didn't want Imran or Sarah to suspect her true intentions until she had a clear answer. Sarah seemed unfazed by Mrs. Layla's explanation, though there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. She kept a polite smile as she served dessert, asking her mother-in-law if she was enjoying her meal. Mrs. Layla felt torn. Sarah's kindness and hospitality made her question herself. Could she really suspect someone who seemed so caring? But as the days passed and her notes continued to point to the same ingredients, Mrs. Layla felt her resolve harden. She realized that no matter how kind Sarah seemed, she needed to protect herself and her health. On the 4th Sunday of her investigation, Mrs. Layla decided to take her plan one step further. She asked Sarah if she could help with the cooking, hoping that by watching closely, she might learn exactly what was going into each dish. Sarah's reaction surprised her. She hesitated, an unusual expression flashing across her face before she recovered with a warm smile. "Oh, Ami, you're a guest. You don't need to worry about helping," Sarah replied cheerfully. "I'll handle everything." Something about Sarah's quick refusal struck Mrs. Layla as odd. It was the first time Sarah had ever been reluctant to let her help in the kitchen. Why would she be so against it now? The question lingered in Mrs. Layla's mind, adding to her growing unease. As she sat down to dinner that evening, her senses were heightened. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was hidden right before her eyes, and that her suspicions, as hard as they were to accept, might have some truth to them. That night, Mrs. Layla reviewed her journal, and the pattern stood out as clear as day. Every time she felt ill, it was after a dish containing one specific spice, one Sarah always used generously. Mrs. Layla felt a chill run down her spine. She couldn't ignore the evidence any longer. Her instincts had been right all along. Now, with the truth nearly in her grasp, Mrs. Layla knew she would have to confront Sarah in a way that would finally reveal what was happening. Her heart ached with the fear of what this confrontation might mean for her family. But she could no longer let herself fall ill each week without knowing why. With her resolve firm and her next steps clear, Mrs. Layla prepared herself for the difficult conversation ahead. Confronting the truth. The following Sunday, Mrs. Layla arrived at Sarah and Imran's house with a quiet determination. Her heart was heavy, and she knew the evening would bring difficult truths to light. For weeks, she had documented every dish, every ingredient, and every reaction. The evidence pointed to one clear answer. A specific spice Sarah often used was making her sick. But why? Was it simply a coincidence, or was there something more deliberate behind it? As they sat down to dinner, Mrs. Layla watched Sarah closely, noticing each movement, each sprinkle of spice added with care. The familiar dishes were set before her, each beautifully prepared. But tonight, Mrs. Layla wasn't going to let another meal pass without addressing her suspicions. As they began eating, Mrs. Layla felt the usual symptoms start to creep in, the heaviness in her stomach, the nausea rising. She took a deep breath, then gently set her fork down. Looking up at Sarah, she mustered all the calm she could manage. "Sarah, there's something I'd like to discuss," she began, her tone soft but firm. "For a while now, I've noticed I feel unwell after certain meals. I didn't want to make a fuss, but I'd done a bit of observing and tracking, and I believe a particular spice is causing my reactions." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise, and her hands paused midair as she was reaching for a glass of water. "Oh, Amy, that's terrible. I'm so sorry to hear that," she replied, her tone a mix of concern and unease. "But are you sure? I always use fresh ingredients. I know you take great care with your cooking, Sarah, and I appreciate it very much." Mrs. Layla replied gently. "But I'd like to make a small request to try an experiment, just to see if I'm right. Would you mind preparing a meal without that particular spice next time?" There was a moment of hesitation on Sarah's face. For the first time, Mrs. Layla saw a flicker of discomfort and perhaps even defensiveness. "Of course, Amy," Sarah said, though her voice was softer, almost uncertain. "If that's what you want, I'll do it. I never meant to make you feel unwell." Mrs. Layla nodded, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. She wanted to believe Sarah's words, but something in her daughter-in-law's hesitation left her uneasy. She sensed that there was more beneath the surface, something that Sarah wasn't saying. As dinner continued, the usual warmth of their family gathering felt overshadowed by a silent tension. Imran noticed the change and glanced between his mother and wife, sensing that something was wrong, but unsure what to say. That night, as Mrs. Layla returned home, she couldn't shake the feeling that this conversation had only scratched the surface. She had taken the first step in addressing her suspicions, but deep down, she knew the real truth was still hidden. The silent investigation. Over the next few days, Mrs. Layla grew more convinced that her conversation with Sarah hadn't revealed the full truth. The subtle hesitations, the fleeting expressions of discomfort, everything pointed to something deeper. But she was still unsure whether Sarah's actions were deliberate or if the sickness was simply a misunderstanding. Either way, Mrs. Layla felt compelled to get to the bottom of it. Determined, she decided to carry out her own quiet investigation. She thought carefully about her options and remembered that she had a close friend, Mrs. Anissa, who was skilled in herbal remedies and had a vast knowledge of spices. If anyone could help her identify whether there was something unusual in Sarah's cooking, it would be her. After a few days, she invited Mrs. Anissa to her house, explaining her situation in as much detail as she could without sounding overly suspicious. "I need you to help me identify if there's something odd about the spices or herbs I'm reacting to," she said carefully, trying not to sound accusatory. Mrs. Anissa nodded thoughtfully. "Bring me a sample of the food, and I'll test it for anything unusual. It could be something as simple as a mild allergy, or it might be a specific combination that doesn't sit well with you." That Sunday, Mrs. Layla went to Imran and Sarah's house as usual, but this time, she carried a discreet container in her bag. As dinner was served, she carefully took a small portion of each dish, quietly wrapping it up to take back home. Sarah didn't seem to notice, but Mrs. Layla's heart raced the entire evening. The next day, she met with Mrs. Anissa and handed over the samples. Mrs. Anissa promised to analyze them, checking each ingredient as thoroughly as possible. Mrs. Layla returned home feeling a mix of anticipation and dread, knowing that whatever Mrs. Anissa found might change the way she saw her daughter-in-law forever. A few days later, Mrs. Anissa called with her findings. Her tone was serious as she spoke. "Layla, I found something that could explain your illness. There is a particular herb in these samples that's known to cause reactions if used in high amounts. It's a common herb, but when it's overused, it can lead to symptoms like nausea and stomach discomfort." Mrs. Layla's heart sank. She knew the herb well. It was a simple ingredient often used in small amounts for flavor. But why would Sarah use so much of it, knowing it could make someone sick? With this knowledge in hand, Mrs. Layla felt more conflicted than ever. Part of her didn't want to believe that Sarah could be intentionally causing her discomfort. Yet the evidence pointed to a deliberate pattern. She realized that the time had come for a serious conversation. She decided to confront Sarah directly, not out of anger, but to seek the truth. It was painful to think that her son's wife might harbor such feelings toward her, but Mrs. Layla knew she had to protect herself, no matter the outcome. With her resolve firm, Mrs. Layla prepared herself for the final confrontation. The shocking truth. The next Sunday, Mrs. Layla arrived at Sarah and Imran's house, her heart heavy with the knowledge that this visit would likely change everything. She had gathered the evidence, and now there was no turning back. She knew the confrontation wouldn't be easy, but the truth had to come out. Sarah greeted her with a warm smile as usual, though Mrs. Layla couldn't help but notice a slight stiffness in her posture. Was she nervous? Or was it just her imagination? Mrs. Layla tried to ignore the unease settling in her chest as she sat down to eat, but this time she wasn't focused on the food. She was focused on Sarah's every move, watching closely for any signs that might reveal the truth. As the meal progressed, Mrs. Layla felt the familiar symptoms begin to creep in: nausea, dizziness, and a growing heaviness in her stomach. She set her fork down, her eyes locking with Sarah's. There was no turning back now. "Sarah," Mrs. Layla began, her voice steady, but tinged with sadness, "I need to talk to you about something serious. For the past few weeks, I've been getting sick after eating your meals. I thought it was just a coincidence at first, but now I believe it's because of one particular ingredient." Sarah looked taken aback, her fork pausing midair. What do you mean, Amy?" she asked, trying to hide the tension in her voice. Mrs. Layla took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "I've been keeping track of what I eat, and I've discovered that the same spice is in every meal that makes me feel ill. It's a herb, one you use often. I didn't want to say anything before, but now I think I have to." Sarah's face turned pale. For a moment, there was a heavy silence between them. Mrs. Layla could see the conflict in her daughter-in-law's eyes, but there was also something else, something darker. "Amy, I didn't mean for you to get sick," Sarah said softly, but her voice lacked the sincerity Mrs. Layla had expected. It was almost as if she was trying to hide something, to cover up the truth. "Then why?" Mrs. Layla asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you keep using it if you knew it made me unwell? Was it intentional?" Sarah's eyes flickered, her gaze dropping to her plate as she swallowed hard. I didn't want to upset anyone. But the truth is, it's not just the herb. I've been putting something in your food to help with your health issues, something that I thought would improve your condition. I didn't think you'd notice." Mrs. Layla's heart raced, her mind struggling to understand what Sarah was saying. "What do you mean, help with my health issues?" Sarah took a deep breath and finally met her mother-in-law's eyes. "I didn't want to hurt you, Amy. I've been adding a small amount of an herbal supplement to your meals. It's supposed to help with digestion and energy, but I didn't realize it would affect you the way it has. I thought it was harmless." The room felt like it was closing in on Mrs. Layla. Her mind was spinning. This wasn't what she had expected. "So, you've been secretly giving me something without telling me?" she asked, her voice cracking with disbelief. "I just wanted to help," Sarah pleaded, her voice trembling. "I knew you were struggling with your health, and I thought this would make a difference. I never meant for you to get sick." Mrs. Layla sat back in her chair, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, hurt, and betrayal. She had trusted Sarah, treated her like a daughter, and now this. A secret, hidden agenda that had affected her health for weeks without her knowledge. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Mrs. Layla felt her heart break, but she also felt a strange sense of relief. The truth was out. She could now make sense of her suffering, even if it meant facing the painful reality that her daughter-in-law had betrayed her trust. Imran entered the room just then, noticing the tension between the two women. He looked from his mother to Sarah, confusion written all over his face. "What's going on?" he asked. Before either woman could speak, Mrs. Layla stood up, her voice steady despite the hurt in her heart. "Imran, there's something you need to know. Your wife has been giving me something in my food without telling me, thinking she was helping me. But instead, she made me sick." Imran turned to Sarah, his face a mixture of disbelief and confusion. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice quiet. Sarah hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. I thought I was doing the right thing," she said, her voice breaking. "I never meant for it to go this far." Mrs. Layla shook her head, a sadness in her eyes. "You should have told me, Sarah. We could have talked about it. But now, I don't know what to believe anymore." Imran looked between them, his heart heavy with the weight of the truth. He knew this would change everything, but for now, all he could do was listen and try to make sense of what had just been revealed. The storm that had been building between his mother and wife had finally erupted, and the aftermath would be far from easy.